Welcome to This Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you tuning in. Today, we're going to tackle one of the most urgent and frankly complex challenges facing business leaders right now. How exactly do you legally and safely deploy Agentic AI? We're going to look at this specifically through the lens of Singapore's highly rigorous new regulations and explore how a framework called IPE is rapidly becoming the absolute gold standard for compliance. So, if you've been looking for a structured, efficient way to understand exactly what it takes to govern autonomous AI, you are definitely in the right place.
Picture this high-stakes scenario for a second. An autonomous AI agent working away in your finance department suddenly hallucinates and authorizes a massive, totally incorrect vendor payment. Now, who is accountable for that? Is it the engineer who tweaked the model, the manager who bought the software, or maybe the AI itself? For CXOs and IT leaders, this isn't some distant science fiction anymore. It is a very real, very pressing operational risk today. And this explainer is critical because we're going to break down exactly how you answer that question and, more importantly, how you prevent that disaster from happening in the first place. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at the AI governance illusion, then redefine AI as fundamentally a process problem, and introduce the IPE framework. After that, we'll solve the four core dimensions, define real technical boundaries, and finish up with a concrete real-world example. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the AI governance illusion. And my prompt engineering just isn't enough.
Okay, let's really dive into this. Back in May 2024, Singapore's Infocom Media Development Authority published version 1.5 of the Model AI Governance Framework, or MGF. It's a fantastic, incredibly detailed document, but if you read it closely, there's a bit of a Trojan horse concept hiding inside. It turns out, true governance isn't what most executives assume it is. Traditionally, we think about model governance, restricting prompt layers or tuning the AI itself. But the MGF is actually demanding standard operating procedures, rigid workflow sequencing, and deterministic system controls. So let's just dismantle that misconception right off the bat. AI governance for autonomous agents is not purely a software issue. It's actually a process architecture problem.
And that brings us smoothly to Section 2. AI is a process problem, the missing foundation for AI agents.
The MGF places a huge focus on bounding an AI's action space, basically defining what it can legally and safely touch. The massive, glaring danger they point out is the risk of cascading AI errors. If an agent slips up on step 1 and it's operating without strict process boundaries, well, that error spreads like wildfire across subsequent steps. And here is the harsh reality. Most organizations racing to deploy AI agents are going to fail baseline requirements. Why? Because they literally lack documented business process boundaries. Think about it. You can't bound an agent's action space if you don't have a process boundary to begin with. You can't assign human accountability without named human owners. And you absolutely cannot test whether an agent is making the right tool calls if you haven't documented what the correct sequence looks like independent of the AI. Which leads us directly to our solution in Section 3, meet the IPE framework, building the governance scaffolding. Now, what's really interesting about this is Integrated Process Excellence, or IPE. It's a process deployment framework originally created by John Cushat. And the amazing part? It wasn't just invented yesterday to appease AI regulators. It's a pre-existing, incredibly structural solution that provides the exact scaffolding these new regulations demand. It's like a giant puzzle, and it breaks a business down into 3 simple levels, long before any technology is applied. First, you have the area. That's the overall domain, something like customer onboarding. Second is the activity. Those are the discrete task groupings making up that domain. And third, you have the element, the individual, specific process steps. You literally map the whole thing out before an AI agent even enters the room. And within every single one of those elements, IPE applies a strict causal data architecture. You can think of this like a cascading line of dominoes. First, you have key input variables, or KIVs. That's the data and permissions required to start. Then, key process variables, or KPVs, the rules and approvals checked during the step. And finally, key output variables, or KOVs, the measurable results. The KOV of one step directly feeds into the KIV of the next step. So, if an AI agent hallucinates or makes a mistake, this tight causal chain instantly stops the dominoes from falling. It physically prevents those compounding errors we talked about earlier. All right, let's put this into action and Section 4, solving the 4 dimensions, mapping IPE to the Singapore MGF.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how the blueprint comes together. The four core dimensions of the MGF, that's assess and bound risk, human accountability, technical controls, and end-user responsibility, they map perfectly to what IPE structurally provides out of the box. We're essentially taking what would normally be a massive, overwhelming 51 control compliance checklist and translating it into something completely manageable. Let's zoom in on a couple of these dimensions to see how it works. Let's start with assessing and bounding risk. The absolute beauty here is that organizations do not need to invent some brand new, highly complex risk scoping exercise from scratch. If you're using IPI, you simply take your existing process map and point it at the AI agent. Those key input variables we just talked about, they act as your direct, pre-existing least privilege boundary. You're basically telling the AI, hey, you only get access to the exact data required for this specific element, nothing more. Done. It's incredibly elegant.
Next up, human accountability. The MJF is constantly warning us about this idea of diffused accountability. That dangerous situation where everyone just assumes someone else is keeping an eye on the AI. Well, IPLL eliminates that entirely. Why? Because every single activity and element already has a named human owner and a KPV quality checkpoint built right in. You are just converting your normal, everyday process quality checks into mandatory human approval checkpoints for the AI agent. The human owner is already on the record, plain and simple.
Another crucial dimension is end-user responsibility, and the MJF highlights a fascinating and scary risk here, tradecraft loss. What actually happens when agents absorb all our entry-level tasks, and suddenly nobody in the company knows how to do the job manually anymore? It's a huge problem. But because IPE documents the independent causal logic of an element, the inputs, the process, the outputs, you successfully preserve that operational tradecraft. Even if an AI has been running that job flawlessly for 2 years, if it suddenly fails, you have the exact step-by-step blueprint to train a human back into that role instantly.
Moving right along to Section 5, the real technical boundary, separating process from engineering. Now, it is absolutely critical to clarify here that IPE is not some magic bullet that replaces your cybersecurity team. Not at all. Look at the dedicated engineering requirements. IPE gives you the structure and the scaffolding, for sure, but you still absolutely need dedicated technical teams to do the heavy lifting. IPE tells you who needs an identity, but your IT team still has to build the cryptographic identity. IPE tells you where the human approval checkpoint needs to be, but engineering actually builds the approval workflow tooling and that immutable log infrastructure. Essentially, IPE scopes and routes the work so your brilliant engineers aren't just guessing where to bolt on security after an incident has already happened. Let's wrap things up with Section 6, Process Governs, Tools Execute, the accounts payable example. Let's move to and see how this actually builds out in reality, bringing this abstract framework into the real world. If you map out accounts payable using IPE, you'll naturally have different elements based purely on reversibility. Step 1 is invoice intake. It's low severity, fully reversible, awesome. Let the full AI agent handle the whole shebang. Step 2 is exception handling. That's moderate severity, so the agent can diagnose the issue, but a human has to actually hit that KPA approval checkpoint. Then, Step 3 is payment release. This is high severity and totally irreversible, so no AI agent is allowed here at all. IPE dictates exactly which steps the agent is allowed to touch, keeping your entire deployment perfectly, securely aligned with your risk tiering. And the best part? You don't even have to build this massive architecture from scratch. Organizations can dramatically accelerate this whole foundation using IPE packs. These are basically pre-built, sector-specific starting maps of areas, activities, and elements fully loaded with their associated KIV, KPV, and KOV variable sets. It totally eliminates the dread of starting from a blank page and lets you jump straight into adapting the framework to your unique operations. It's a real game changer. Which brings us to our core thesis, stated boldly. Process governs. Tools execute. AI agents are undeniably powerful tools, but at the end of the day, they are just tools. Only a fully governed process can determine what work should be executed, by whom, within what specific boundary, and to what verified standard. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to take back to your teams. If an AI agent hallucinates a massive error in your system tomorrow morning, do you know exactly which documented process boundary it just crossed and exactly who is accountable? If you don't, well, it's time to start building your foundation. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.